Now, from Washington, D.C., Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome to The World Over Live. The U.S. Bishop's Fortnight for Freedom has come to a close. On this special Independence Day edition of The World Over, we'll discuss the state of religious liberty, not only in the U.S., but around the world. We'll examine the political and cultural implications and put this Fortnight for Freedom campaign in perspective. John Garvey, the president of the Catholic University of America, will explore the growing religious liberty challenges, including the health care mandate, which his university is suing the government over. And later, political consultant and commentator Mary Matalin reacts to the Supreme Court health care ruling. I also want to hear her thoughts on the likely impact of the bishop's religious liberty campaign, politically speaking. Then we'll take a look at the state of religious freedom all over the world, especially in Asia and Africa, with Lord David Alton. He's a member of the British House of Lords. Finally, we'll show you some highlights from a 2012 National Religious Freedom Conference hosted by the Ethics and Public Policy Center right here in D.C. If you'd like to comment on the program, the email is worldover@EWTN.com. Let's get right to it. My first guest is a renowned constitutional scholar. He served as the Dean of Boston College Law School before becoming the 15th president of the Catholic University of America here in D.C. CUA has filed suit against the Obama administration over the HHS contraceptive mandate, a lawsuit that continues to move forward. Here to give his impression of the High Court ruling, as well as his perspective on the challenges to religious liberty, is CUA President John Garvey. Great to see you again.
Raymond, very nice to be here.
Thanks for coming out. Let's talk about this historic ruling. John Roberts wrote the majority opinion. Some are saying this is a victory in that he has contained the expansion of the Commerce Clause. Your perspective on that ruling?
Well, he has contained the reach of the Commerce Clause, but he's allowed similar possibilities by using the taxing power. Like if the government can tax you for not doing what it wants you to do, then it's accomplished the same objective. Yeah. In some ways, the most important part of the ruling might be the limitation on the spending power, the government's ability to threaten to take away people's money for not doing
which was part of the Medicaid expansion.
Part of the Medicaid expansion. So we'll have to see how it works out.
Now, there's been a lot of confusion, particularly by folks who are focused on the religious liberty component of this health care bill. They're worried that somehow the ruling we saw last week will impact this HHS mandate. There really is no crossover, or is there?
No, there isn't. It might very well have been that the court's decision on this health care law generally would have had an effect on our suit over the mandate. But ours is a very small line in a bill that runs a couple of thousand pages, and the court's decision affected the overall structure of the bill, but the mandate remains untouched.
But what if they end up saying the fines that they would apply if Catholic University of America does not provide contraceptive, abortifacient, and sterilization services to its employees, the fine being applied is merely a tax? Might they come down to that?
That wouldn't have any effect on our claim that it nevertheless violates the First Amendment. They can't impose a tax on speech against Democrats or Republicans. So I don't think that that's a way of saving the bill insofar as it applies to our institutions.
Why are you suing, and how onerous is the penalty attached to this HHS contraceptive mandate?
The grounds for the suit are fairly easy to understand. We're the National University of the Catholic Church. Begun by the bishops in the latter part of the 19th century, we educate about 7,000 students, undergraduates and graduates, most of them Catholic, and we're interested in teaching them not just about Mandarin Chinese and mechanical engineering, but also about their faith as Catholics. And the law requires us to provide free contraceptive coverage to both employees and students, and when we're telling them at the same time that these are immoral activities. So the penalty is pretty onerous. For us, the fine would be $2,000 per person who's not covered. That amounts to about $2.6 million a year. So
wow.
That's a lot of money at our university.
Yeah. So what are you going to do? I mean,
well,
in the absence, this kicks in August. What happens?
It kicks in August for some of the covered groups. We think that we're covered by an extension that will take us until August of next year. But beginning this fall, we're going to have to begin negotiating with our insurers about the terms of the policy that we're going to adopt next year. So we have filed suit along with the archdioceses of New York and Washington, the University of Notre Dame, and in all 43 Catholic institutions to challenge the law both under the First Amendment and under a law called the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
And what do you think? I mean, some bishops are saying, I had Cardinal George on the show a few weeks ago. He said there are a handful of options here. You pay the fines and you go out of business, you shutter your doors, or you simply let the institution go secular. Which are you comfortable with doing?
Well, I'm not comfortable with any of them. We certainly don't want to shut down the National University of the Catholic Church, and we don't want to turn it into something other than what it is. So that's the reason we've filed suit. I should say that this is always, you hope, the last option that you're going to have to pursue. There have been complaints that I've heard about the church, the universities, a number of archdioceses making these claims about religious liberty too much of a political issue.
Yeah.
I think that in an ideal world, they are a political issue. I think protecting religious liberty is the business of the Congress, the state legislatures, the executive branch, and federal agencies, that in making their rules and laws, they should be concerned with the liberty of Americans as one of the goods that they want to protect, along with health care. So I think it's naturally a political issue. It's not, I should say, a Republican or a Democrat issue.
Right.
Neither party has distinguished itself in the last 10 years in protecting religious freedom, but we hope that they'll both concern themselves with it.
Let's talk about these threats to religious liberty. It is far beyond just the health care, in the area of health care. Tell us about some of the other areas that you're concerned about, that the bishops are concerned about. You had a great presentation to them during their
There are any number of them. The health care one is the one that's been on people's mind most recently, but there was a big case in the Supreme Court this year about what's called the ministerial exemption from a lot of anti-discrimination laws. The question was whether anti-discrimination laws apply to religious institutions, in this case a Lutheran high school. For years, the lower federal courts have applied a ministerial exemption, saying it's the business of, say, the Lutheran Church to hire its own religion teachers, to hire its own ministers. I guess it's no surprise that the EEOC would argue for application of the non-discrimination laws. It was disappointing to see the Solicitor General's office and the Department of Justice arguing that churches were no different from the Boy Scouts or other nonprofits. The Supreme Court unanimously held in favor of the religious institutions and against or in favor of upholding the exemption.
And this is part of what concerns you. I know it's what concerns many of the bishops. The attempt to redefine what a religious institution is, to differentiate between religious liberty and the freedom of worship. Why is that such a sore point?
There are two different kinds of concerns that we have with religious freedom these days. One is the strength of the right itself, whether it can be defeated by an interest in historic preservation or health care or so on, regardless of who's making the claim. The second is about the scope of who's protected by the right. And the unfortunate thing that we've seen in the case of the healthcare mandate is an effort by HHS to say that it protected dioceses but not Catholic Charities or the Catholic University of America or the Little Sisters of the Poor or any number of other religious organizations, or not to mention religious private employers or groups like the Knights of Columbus. Right. That's one example, but there are others. You know, there are a couple of cases that have been decided by regional directors of the National Labor Relations Board, saying that St. Xavier University in Chicago or Manhattan College in New York are not Catholic colleges for purposes of the Wagner Act. And that's distressing in the same way. The Labor Board seems to be taking the position that you're not a Catholic university unless you only hire Catholics and only admit Catholics and only teach Christian doctrine in your academic affairs, and that's not what academic freedom and Catholic universities are about.
In your speech to the bishops, you said, the landscape of religious freedom had changed and the purview had narrowed. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the things that happened in 1990, I said a moment ago that it's neither a Republican nor a Democratic issue. There was a case called Employment Division against Smith in 1990 in which the Supreme Court held that religious liberty didn't protect as much as we had thought for many years, that really it was only a matter of non-discrimination, and that if the government passed a law that was neutral and generally applicable, it could override any kinds of religious activities. So, for example, the government could literally, consistently with the First Amendment, pass a law forbidding the consumption of alcohol, even by Catholics or Episcopalians at Mass or Jews at a Seder. And that law was one, that decision in Smith was supported by many Republican appointees to the Supreme Court.
That's amazing.
Just
that the idea continues to percolate out there, and that we see it sticking its head up here and there. Why do we see these increasing threats to religious liberty?
Well, you know, I think that there are two different kinds of questions. One is, when the Supreme Court decided this case in 1990, they said, you know, the protection of religious liberty is not in jeopardy. You can always look to your elected officials. And if the people we elect to Congress and the state legislatures and the executive branches of government see religion as important as the citizens do, then we really don't have anything to worry about. And for 200 years, that was pretty much the case. What's concerning is that the recent kinds of actions that we've seen have been ones taken by executive agencies or by Congress, and we have nowhere to turn then in that case, except it might be to the Religious Freedom Restoration Act.
Yeah, no, it's troubling, and you see this. You made reference in your speech that it is the diminution of faith, the loss of faith across the board, that is perhaps, if not encouraging, allowing these threats to religious liberty.
I was encouraging I spoke to the bishops in Atlanta a few weeks ago, and I was saying that really I thought that in the long run, the salvation of religious freedom lay in reawakening Americans to the importance of religion itself. If the members of Congress and federal agencies and the executive branch think that religion is really important, then they'll be concerned to protect and nourish it. What's concerning is that it may be that people don't care so much anymore, not just in Congress, but in the population at large from which we choose our elected officials. And so the real worry is that religion itself is maybe less important than it once was to Americans.
I think people have also forgotten, when you read those letters of John Adams to Abigail, his wife, during the debate over the Declaration of Independence, in all of those letters there are references to God and a sense of the moral people, and that it was really an intermingling of both faith with this patriotism, with this yearning for liberty. It seems in time we've forgotten and separated the two, or attempted to.
We've gone up and down on this. I don't know that that era was, if we consider the colonies as a whole, a particularly religious one, although it certainly was true of Adams and of Washington and of many of the
Hamilton
of the founders, that religion was especially important to them. Then we went through a period of the Great Awakening, as we call it, and the Second Great Awakening in America, where our ardor was a little more fervent. So I hope that this is one that will that will change the direction of our slide.
In our final moments, do you believe what we're dealing with then, in regard at least to this health care problem and these other attacks on religious liberty, whether it be Catholic charities closing because of gay marriage statutes, or the EEOC wanting to clamp down on the ministerial exemption? What's at stake here a political question at the end of the day? And is it up to the people watching and listening to exercise their final vote at the ballot box come November?
Well, it's both a religious and a political question. Religious liberty only matters in a country where religion itself matters. The reason we have a First Amendment is that the framers of our Bill of Rights cared a lot about religion and wanted to provide for its protection. Since the Supreme Court's decision in Smith in 1990, it's also become a political question in the most obvious sense that our protection is to be found in the first and maybe the last instance with the people that we elect to Congress and the presidency. And so I think it's important to ask them what they think about it in the course of an election season.
Very good. John Garvey, thank you so much for being here. For more information on President Garvey and the work of CUA, go to cua.edu. Up next, political commentator and consultant Mary Matalin is here to handicap the political impact of the Fortnight for Freedom and the state of the Catholic vote. The World Over Live continues in a moment. Stay right there.
Now, once again, Raymond Arroyo.
Welcome back to The World Over. With the Catholic Bishops' Fortnight for Freedom officially concluded on this July 4th, what's the likely political effect? And where might the all-important Catholic vote go come November? To provide some answers, she's a political strategist, a CNN contributor, and an author who also happens to be Mrs. James Carville. Please welcome back to the program, Mary Matalin.
Who's a good Catholic, let's point out.
And a good Catholic, a convert.
James is a good Catholic.
Well, both of you are. Both of you are.
James was an altar boy.
Well, he didn't convert, but you did.
No, I did.
He's been there all along. When was you? Did you
our
convert?
mutual friend, Monsignor Christopher Nolte. He's a good shepherd.
You see that?
Growing his flock.
He's a great guy.
Yes, he is.
Let's talk for a moment about this Fortnight for Freedom. You've no doubt seen it in New Orleans, where you live now. I know they've been having all sorts of events and educational moments in the parish. What do you think is the overall effect of to the Catholic people?
I don't think that the effect is going to be is reflected in the numbers. President Obama, candidate Obama, won 54% of the Catholics. That is diminished. The majority support among Catholics is diminished. But what is hard to capture in polls, but we see in the pews, intensity. Intensity is really important. As you know, we've had this conversation. A number of us came together to start ConscienceCause.com in response to this attack, as assault on religious liberty. And it's all denominations, it's all parties, as the President was saying. This is not a Democratic-Republican thing, but I think the intensity of the shock that this government founded on the first principle, the first right, religious liberty, would do this in such a blatant way, would so assault. So I think the intensity of pushback is important, and where these voters are. They are swing voters. Catholics are swing voters, and they're concentrated in swing states. It was a strategic blunder of some magnitude.
The impact of this Supreme Court ruling, Mary, what do you think it will be? Many were saying if the Supreme Court had just knocked it down, it may have taken a lot of the steam out of this whole religious liberty push. Do you think that's an accurate appraisal?
I think this is more accurate. That my colleagues in the conservative movement said, to the extent that they have some reservations about Governor Romney, they don't think he's conservative enough, and they used to say, this is before his nomination, he used to say, well, we're going to focus on the Senate. Now they're saying we need the White House and the Senate, and they are really intensely now involved in support of the Romney candidacy. That's very important. The first and obvious impact of this, if you're political, was the scores of thousands of small contributors. The governor's campaign raised over $4 million within hours of this ruling. People are engaged. It's a sleeping giant. It was a sleeping giant that was first kicked away with the Obamacare, or the oxymoron, Affordable Health Care, Affordable Care Act. It's anything but for all kinds of different reasons. But then they're re-kicking in voters saying of all stripes, in the midterms, in the special elections, in the Scott Brown in Massachusetts, and now again they keep voicing their opinions and their desires for their Congress and their president, they keep getting ignored.
You know, and the HHS mandate has set off a firestorm. And I think, you know, when you have parties as diverse as the Knights of Columbus to Catholic University to America, this is certainly not a partisan, you know, response. These are people who are definitively aggrieved and being attacked by a mandate that is arbitrary and seemingly crushes religious liberties.
And at a practical level, what you discussed with President Garvey, the collapse of these intermediary associations that aren't necessarily the church, that you know from our hometown, New Orleans,
yep.
We would not have come back from Katrina. We would not be where we are today without the work of the Archdiocese. And that's just, that all goes away. That's
Catholic charities, the religious and nuns teaching in the schools, without that whole network, and all of that is imperiled. When these fines kick in, tied to this mandate, not putting aside the fines in the healthcare bill itself, but just the mandate, I don't know how these organizations can remain afloat.
Well, they won't, and that's what's happened in Illinois and other states who were responding to the adoption rules. But I want to say this about Justice Roberts, and I'm in the minority among my conservative friends. But as our founders said, as Franklin said, a republic, sir, if you can keep it, it is our charge. There is no freedom without religion. There's no religion without freedom. That's how we were founded. It's in our charge to maintain that vigilance generation after generation after generation. And that's what he said. It's either an unconstitutional penalty or it's a constitutional tax. If you don't want a tax, you got to vote it out.
Right.
I think he made it so much more clear, and I respect my conservative friends who are have much better legal minds than my own. But we can't, it doesn't matter if citizens aren't participating at the level Pope John Paul II said, to have the courage of civic engagement.
Well, he said, Roberts says at the end of his ruling, we're not here to protect the people from the consequences of their actions at the voting booth. That's where they can either repair this or move it in another direction or accept it. Or
turn into France.
Or become France. But Mary, do you really believe this was a sound ruling? So many lawyers I talked to, so many constitutional scholars say this is shoddy jurisprudence, that he waved a wand and declared a penalty, a tax to make it constitutional, and he overstretched his bounds.
Again, well, I know all these great minds, and I love dancing on the head of a pin. I liked doing it in law school. I like doing it with my crazy husband now. But the result of this is that the Commerce Clause wasn't stretched. Very, very important. We've been trying to deal with that for decades. And a tax is a tax. It's only constitutional if it's a tax. What he did by saying it's only constitutional if it's a tax, and the president keeps saying it's not a tax, it's not a tax, he has, through this ruling, said it's either a tax or you're a liar. I hate to say that about the president. And as we know how this has been scored, 76% of this tax is going to be imposed on people, families making less than $120,000
But isn't it semantics, Mary? Isn't it really semantics? Whether you'd call it a tax or a penalty, it achieves the same end. The government is coercing you and penalizing you if you don't do something. Isn't that a bad precedent to establish in constitutional law?
But it's a political principle. I keep coming back to what he said. The court is not to protect you from self-governance. The Congress has the power to tax. I gave you the constitutional read. You've got a great dissent here. You've got my great language. I thought it was fantastic. And now it is the responsibility, just as the Catholic community has been awakened to how really we have to keep working for these rights. Then we have to work for our political liberties, and we have to work for our economic liberty. We haven't even talked about the assault on our economic liberties.
Well, let's talk about it. This is the perfect day to talk about it.
Happy 4th of July, happy Independence.
Happy 4th of July to you, and you're wearing your red?
I've got the whole flag thing going. I cry every 4th of July. It's and to think about it, generation after generation has has validated, supported, and furthered our liberty, and we're about to leave, if this is implemented in any fashion, not just erode our religious liberty. We are indebting your kids, my kids, with unsustainable burden, uncarryable burden. You know, God never gives us burdens greater than we can carry. Sorry, we cannot carry.
Yeah, but the Congress
burden.
might. God won't, but Congress might. Yeah, so we'll see what happens. 1/4 of the vote in the American electorate is Catholic.
27%, not to be put too fine a point on it.
Put a little tiny fine point. You are dancing on the head of that needle, aren't you?
2% in an electorate is a lot.
What would be your advice to either? I'm going to ask you to advise both these candidates, Governor Romney and the president. What should they be doing to appeal to Catholic voters? Because right now it looks like in the polls, they're neck and neck, 46% for either candidate.
And I'll say again, the intensity, numbers aren't as relevant as the intensity behind those numbers, and the intensity is with Mitt Romney. The first thing he should do is to come on your show, Raymond, and explain
he was supposed to come a week ago, and they had scheduling difficulties. We'll see.
He really wants to come and just remind people what we've been saying, that this religious liberty is not guaranteed in perpetuity, and he has to explain how it affects their lives. I think people understand more readily than any of the chattering classes here in political understand, because the healthcare premiums in anticipation of implementation have gone up 9%, anticipated to go up another 4%. Those are family budgets. So we have we've diminished the care. Doctors don't want to work under this, and we're increasing the cost of families, and we're indebting the future. Tell me something good there.
Yeah.
Oh, here's something good. Your kids can stay on your insurance till they're 26. Like, get out of my house already.
We don't even want them in the house till they're 26, much less the insurance.
Right.
Now, do you think do you think it's wise politics for the president? He came out with this executive order that restricts deportations of young immigrants, undocumented immigrants, under 30. They're not being deported now. The Catholic Church, the bishops, praised that decision. Was that a good political move to blunt the edges of the firestorm he's facing on the healthcare front?
It was horrific policy, because the kids, the young people who were here by no fault of their own, who are pursuing an education, will be contributing citizens, and those who served so far illegally in the military. Those were the sweeteners in comprehensive immigration. Republicans support that. The reason that for the president's timing is that Marco Rubio, Florida senator, was in the process of garnering bipartisan support that had as one of its sweeteners, its centerpiece, those very two things. So now the president has jeopardized a long-term solution with a short-term political fix. And it's not really even a fix for these kids, because really, would you go expose yourself to deportation, not knowing if this president was going to be elected and this policy would remain in place? And what will happen is those policies that will stay in place, but it will have to be part of a bigger, comprehensive immigration plan, which we've been trying to do for many years now.
Is Rubio moving forward with his plan? It was kind of a quasi-dream act.
I don't think so. No, I think what I think he has said, and Governor Romney has said, is we want to work toward a comprehensive policy, and when there's a new Senate and a new president, we'll make serious policy, not cherry pick.
Now, there is a report in the National Journal, and it said the Romney campaign has declared a ceasefire on health care, that they don't want to talk about this health care issue because Governor Romney passed Romney Care in Massachusetts, the president has his Obamacare, and therefore they want to declare it off limits. Is that a smart strategy? Is that what's happening?
I don't think it's an accurate report. I just saw the governor, and he is very articulate on this, that this mandate, this tax, doesn't operate like the Massachusetts one did. It's done. That one did not cost the state money. It's too, I'm not going to go through it, but he can articulate it, and mostly he can articulate the execution of the 10th Amendment. Okay, what is in one state is not necessarily, and is empirically not good for the nation. So, but they're not mutually exclusive. This is such a drag on our economy, and it portends future no growth. We're growing at 1.9%. We got manufacturing numbers this week done. I'm anticipating another bad jobs. So what, I mean, and a lot of that is the impediment of not just of anticipation of health care. Health care became, in April of 2009, a proxy for the overreach of government. And that's an animating motivation for these awakened people. You know, conservatives work. They don't want to spend a lot of time fooling around in politics. They just want their body politic to be responsive to them. And they're as an animated and intensely in opposition and supportive of repeal of Obamacare, but to limit the big government that Obamacare policy represents.
And you might be able to achieve some of the ends without going about it in this way.
Raymond, we've been working on this for 20 years. We know what the answers are, that it's consumer-based, economy of a scale, associated health plans, where private companies and private income is treated the way big, you know, the system's been messed up, the healthcare delivery system, since Franklin and Roosevelt messed it up so to keep wage and prices down. Well, we know how to do it, and we have made great savings. So as Governor Romney said in Utah, he is very excited to be here for what's going to be the American resurgence. We know how to do this. We're poised.
A final question. Where do you think Catholics go now? How engaged will they be in this process? Or will we see what we've seen in the past, where they kind of wait till the last minute and they become the little sort of independents that swing one way or another?
I'll say I can give you poll numbers, but I think anecdotes are better to say this. We have a large Catholic, robust Catholic community in New Orleans, but we have a little farm here, and it's the Bible Belt, and there aren't very many Catholics. My girls were baptized out there, and usually there's a handful, little teeny tiny chapel there. I went Sunday Mass. It was standing room only, and our priest out there was, Catholics are coming home. Catholics Come Home, another great website. They're coming home for all kinds of different reasons, and even those that don't consider themselves politically and wouldn't even agree, this is like conscience cause, they don't agree on all these issues. We have a divergent views on contraception and conscience cause, but they do agree on the necessity of the first right. No freedom without religion, no religion without freedom.
Yeah. Very good. Mary Matalin, thank you so much for coming out.
Always a pleasure.
We'll see you next time in New Orleans, I hope.
At your restaurant.
Up next, what's the state of religious freedom outside the United States? Here's my interview with Lord David Alton. Lord Alton, great to see you. We have not seen each other in the flesh since the great papal visit to the UK. That was such an amazing
true. That's when you were in the House of Lords and you came in.
Yeah, well, you took me around. That's why I was in the House of Lords.
It was just before Pope Benedict came. It was an extraordinary visit, and we're still talking about it.
Oh, no, it's one of those visits that you keep feeling the reverberations of. Let's talk about religious liberty. You have been on the forefront of religious freedom and human rights around the world. I want to hit some of these hot spots because we've been so focused on this American situation, you sometimes lose sight of what's happening around the world, even in the UK. Tell us what's happening there. I read this article that there are hostilities toward religion in the United Kingdom, no less?
Well, Pope Benedict's visit was a curtain raiser to some of this. What I call the angry atheists were out in the streets in large numbers. But by the end of the visit, I mean, his gentleness and his pastoral qualities had totally disarmed them. And it was an interesting moment, I think, in Britain, where people started to look at what they were losing. And Pope Benedict said to us, don't forget your story, remember who you are. And there is a danger in Britain that, despite the fact that we've been Christians since Augustine arrived at Ebbsfleet 1,500 years ago and began the evangelization of the country and came as the first Archbishop of Canterbury, sent by Pope Gregory. Despite all of that, despite Judeo-Christian values being in our very bloodstreams, in our DNA, there is a danger that we're beginning to lose that identity. And accompanying this angry atheism have been all sorts of attacks on Christianity, such as the right of someone to wear a cross, for instance, or to have a cross on their chain, the right to have public prayers before public meetings. There was a court case on that subject recently.
I remember.
And perhaps even more worryingly, though, for me, 2 Catholic midwives in Scotland being told that they had to assist in an abortion, that they didn't have the right to invoke the conscience clause. Now, that's a very serious question, which we're having quite a fight about at the moment. But there have been some good things, Raymond, as well. For instance, only this week there's been a vote by the British Medical Association reaffirming their opposition to euthanasia and to assisted suicide. And we've had 3 votes in the British Parliament on that issue, and we've won all of those. So it's not all over yet.
Very interesting. Let's talk about some of the other hot spots that you visited. Sure. You've been in and out of Burma a few times. What is the situation there?
I've been illegally into Burma 3 times over the years, and suddenly the cracks are appearing in the edifice. And the release of Aung San Suu Kyi from house arrest was an extraordinarily important moment. And I was able to meet her last week when she was in the British Parliament. And although there is still fighting in Burma, I mean, there are lots of ethnic minorities. There are the Hmong, the Shan, the Chin, the Karen, the Karenni, about 100 different ethnic minorities. Some of them are Christian as well. And we've not often taken a lot of notice about their plight. It's the National League for Democracy, represented by Aung San Suu Kyi, has made real progress on the issue of democratic representation, and that's terrific. But a lot more has to be done about the ethnic minorities.
You were recently in Northern Korea.
Well, I've been 4 times to North Korea, and I'm chairman of the parliamentary committee in Britain on North Korea. And what's happened in Burma gives me some hope about North Korea. I think
what's the state there, particularly for Christians?
Well, the Vatican only this week issued a statement about North Korea saying that the San Egidio community in Rome have just taken in some food aid into North Korea. This is good news. There is a sort of opening up. Some of the hierarchy from South Korea have been allowed to go to the north to have some discussions there. There's only one church permitted in the whole of North Korea, one Catholic church. But the last time I went there, they allowed me to speak, to give the Pope's greetings, and although this is incredibly tightly controlled, although Mass hasn't been celebrated there officially for 60 years, there is still belief in North Korea. I went to a place called Anju, which is north of Pyongyang, and I asked the mayor what happened to the churches, and she said, oh, they were destroyed in the war 60 years ago, when of course 3 million people lost their lives. And I said, so are there no believers? And she very revealingly said to me, yes, there are, and they meet in the rubble of the Catholic Church every Sunday, and they've been doing that, Raymond, for 60 years.
Oh, my gosh.
Amazing story.
Incredible witness of faith.
Well, people have got to keep praying about North Korea. They need our prayers. 2 million people died during the famine in the 1990s. There are an estimated 300,000 people, according to the United Nations, in the camps there, the gulags. There's a real need for change, and we should pray for the leadership in North Korea, but also for wisdom on the part of our own governments in how we deal with this. The last thing we need is another war on the Korean Peninsula. So we've got to find ways forward. This isn't a radical Islamic state. This isn't Afghanistan or Iraq. This is a creaking Stalinist state which needs renewal. It needs to change, and I think we can see that. Under the surface, there's beginnings of change.
How do you deal with situations like Nigeria, where people are going about their faith, and suddenly a Jeep rolls in with a bomb in it and takes out half the congregation, blows up the church, takes people out in the marketplace? This Boko Haram terrorist group has been laying waste to so many people of faith. It's a targeted campaign. It's a genocide.
It is, but the United States of America and the United Kingdom don't even list Boko Haram as a terrorist organization, and yet within the week before this interview that we're having, 100 Christians have been killed in Nigeria. This is Sudan all over again. Our mutual friend Bishop Makram Gassis, one of the great men I think in the world today.
I agree.
2 million died in South Sudan while the world looked away, mainly Christian people during the war there. In Darfur, mainly Muslim people have been killed as they've attempted to impose Sharia law from Khartoum. 200 to 300,000 dead, 2 million displaced. And even as we're meeting in Blue Nile and South Kordofan, the areas covered by Bishop Gassis's diocese, there is a campaign of genocide, a new campaign underway. That state is run by Omar al-Bashir, who is indicted by the International Criminal Court for crimes against humanity. And yet for many Western countries, we still do business as usual with them. What's happening in Nigeria today is a repeat of Sudan. And it's, again, by Boko Haram, an offshoot of al-Qaeda, an offshoot of all of these militant terrorist organizations. It even means, Boko Haram means destroy Western education, destroy all Western influence in a country which has enjoyed wonderful relations with the West in the past. But they're trying to divide it, north against south, and the world is looking away.
It's terrible. There was a Pew Research Center report that came out, and in it suggested religious minorities most subjected to harassment in the countries of concern are Christians,
yes,
who are harassed at 130 nations, and Muslims who were a close second at 117 nations. What's happening out there?
That report's fascinating because, of course, what they found was that there is religious persecution against every religious minority, Zoroastrians, Baha'is, Hindus, Muslims, Jews, Christians, but the only group who faced persecution in every single one of the listed countries were Christians. So first of all, there is intolerance in the world. There's a fundamentalism which is walking the earth, which we have to be aware of. And the reason I'm in DC at the moment is because of the plight of the Coptic Church in Egypt.
Right.
I'm president of the United Kingdom Coptic Association. We've turned away and not cared what's happened to the largest of the oldest churches in the Middle East, the Coptic Church.
We recently reported a headline where the new president of Egypt met with some representatives of the Coptic Church, a couple of Greeks. He sort of spread it out, Catholic leaders, claiming he would do nothing that would condescend to Christianity, wouldn't tolerate it in his presidency. Do you think that's a true statement?
Well, President Morsi has since then said that he's going to appoint a Coptic vice president and a woman as well as a vice president. I think the jury's out on this, Raymond, because on one hand, if this is just a tokenistic appointment of someone who is just appointed by a Muslim Brotherhood president, what kind of Copt is that going to be? On the other hand, if he genuinely wants to be the president of all of Egypt, well, 1 in 5 Egyptians are Christians, they are Copts. The church was planted 600 years before Islam ever came to Egypt by St. Mark. I mean, this is one of the oldest churches in the world, and the late Pope Shenouda III, who recently died, again was one of the great spiritual leaders, and he and John Paul II enjoyed a close relationship, and Pope John Paul, of course, went to Egypt, where they embraced one another. So these are our brothers and sisters, and there are Catholic Copts as well as Orthodox Copts, and we do need to take an interest in what is happening to them. The massacres that have occurred there in their churches on New Year's Eve in the Church of Two Saints in Alexandria, where dozens of people were injured and many killed. The systematic persecution, the rape of Christian women in order to forcibly convert them. These are wicked things that have been taking place, and we rarely raise our voices.
Before I let you go, there was a report I came across, and the Wall Street Journal was heralding it, that there is a new law being introduced into the Parliament that would compel peers, members of the House of Lords like yourself, to be subject to elections. Your thoughts on this law?
Well, Raymond, I did subject myself to election for many years. I was a member of the House of Commons for 18 years and was privileged to represent the wonderful city of Liverpool. I was appointed to the House of Lords, that's the system that we have at the moment, as a life peer. And I've tried to play my part since I've been there. Well, it's now the intention of the coalition government to reform, as they put it, the House of Lords. But if they're only going to make an echo chamber of the House of Commons, two chambers that are both elected, they'll be forever in dispute with one another. I don't think this has been thought through very well. And, you know, it's a bit like rearranging the deck chairs on the Titanic as it goes down. Right. There are a lot of issues facing Britain today, but if you go down to the local public house and talk to the guys in the public house about what's troubling them at the moment, it'll be unemployment, it'll be the state of the economy, it'll be our health service, it'll be what's happening in our schools. None of them will say to you, David, do something about the House of Lords. I mean, this is a piece of political nonsense, and I'm afraid it's the sort of thing that obsesses the political classes.
You mentioned your healthcare system. We are having our own woes at this moment. The Supreme Court recently ruled that this is a constitutional healthcare law. Your opinion on the direction you see the United States moving in, given the health system already in place in the UK?
Well, my worry about the changes that are proposed in the United States is that, not that poor people won't receive health care, of course, that is something that I personally believe in. My anxiety is that it will introduce, as happens in the United Kingdom, abortion which all people will end up having to pay for, even though they may be opposed to it, and indeed other unethical procedures as well. If I tell you that last week I had a question in the British Parliament, and in answer to it, the government said that 3 teenagers, 3 girls, just between them, had had a total of 24 abortions. First of all, think about the unborn children involved in that, think about the girls involved in that, and then think about the role of the public health service, the National Health Service, in conducting those abortions and in funding it out of public funds, and the consciences of young doctors and nurses who are often drawn into this even though they'd rather not. So America needs to think carefully about the way that it constructs its health service. It may have been in the Supreme Court, but now it will be an issue for the presidential election, and no doubt both of the presidential candidates will be asked to think about these things. I also hope that they will be asked to think about religious liberties and conscience generally, because in the presidential debates, which many of us in Britain were watching with great interest, I was shocked that those issues didn't surface at all in those debates, Raymond.
It's amazing.
They really ought to have done.
For more on the work of Lord David Alton and to follow his efforts on behalf of international religious freedom, visit davidalton.net. Now, before we go, we wanted to bring you some highlights from a recent event on religious freedom here in Washington, D.C. It was sponsored by the Ethics and Public Policy Center. The focus of the event was rising threats to religious liberty. Speakers included Professor Robert George of Princeton, Dr. Richard Land of the Southern Baptist Convention, and Archbishop William Lori of Baltimore, who delivered the keynote address. Here are some highlights. Take a look.
Now, John Henry Newman did not have a tin ear for religion. On the contrary, he was a religious genius. And his understanding of religion enabled him to produce an account of freedom, in particular, freedom of conscience, that was profoundly superior to Mill's and from which we today, including those of us here in this room reflecting on contemporary threats to religious liberty, have a great deal to learn. Let's let Newman speak for himself, for he had already identified in the 19th century the tendency of thought about rights, liberty, and conscience which would become the secular liberal orthodoxy in our own time. So I quote again from the letter to the Duke of Norfolk. Conscience has rights, Newman argues, because it has duties. But in this age, with a large portion of the public, it is the very right and freedom of conscience to dispense with conscience. Conscience is a stern monitor. But in this century, it has been superseded by a counterfeit, which in the 18 centuries prior to it had never been heard of and could not have been mistaken for it if they had. It is the right of self-will. Unquote. Conscience, as Newman understood it, is the very opposite of autonomy, self-will, in the modern liberal sense, of doing as you please, even so long as you don't harm others, or defining for oneself the meaning of life or manufacturing one's own moral universe. Conscience, rather, is nothing less than one's last best judgment, informed by faith and reason, specifying the bearing of moral principles one knows yet in no way makes up for oneself on concrete proposals for action, and thus identifying one's specific duties under the moral law. Conscience is indeed exactly what Newman said it was, a stern monitor. Now contrast this understanding of conscience with what Newman regarded as its counterfeit. Conscience as self-will. That's a matter of emotion, of feeling, not of reason. It's concerned not with the identification of what one has a duty to do or not do, one's feelings to the contrary notwithstanding, but rather and precisely with sorting out one's feelings. Conscience as self-will identifies permissions more than obligations. It licenses behavior by establishing that one doesn't feel bad about doing it, or at least doesn't feel so bad about doing it that one prefers the alternative of not doing it. Now, I'm with Newman. His key distinction is between conscience, authentically understood, and self-will. His central insight, one that we would do very well to remember as the day goes on today, is that conscience has rights because it has duties.
I want to talk a little bit about the government mandates in Obamacare and HHS. This shows either a hostility to religious freedom or a complete ignorance of the First Amendment. It seems to me there are not any other alternatives. This debate is not about contraception, it's about coercion. It's not about Catholics, it's about conscience. It's about religious freedom, not reproductive freedom. This is about principle, not pelvic politics. Make no mistake about it. This is only incidentally about reproductive freedom. It's about the freedom of religious organizations to practice their faith. We believe, as Americans, that every human being has a God-given right of freedom of faith and conscience. Due to our forefathers' persecutions, persistence, and insistence, this freedom is acknowledged and recognized in the First Amendment to the Constitution of the United States. We must not stand by and allow our God-given rights to religious freedom, guaranteed by the Bill of Rights, to be atrophied, neutered, and confined and restricted to mere freedom of worship. As Cardinal Dolan has said in his February 22nd letter to his fellow Catholic bishops, the Obama administration has attempted to reduce this free exercise to a privilege, arbitrarily granted as a mere exemption from an all-encompassing extreme form of secularism. Indeed, I think I could make an argument that this extreme secularist mindset embodied in the HHS mandate violates not only the First Amendment's free exercise clause, but the Establishment Clause as well. When the federal government asserts the right to universally mandate actions, trample religious convictions, and then grant exemptions to those it so chooses, the government is behaving perilously like a secular theocracy granting ecclesiastical indulgences to a chosen few.
I live near the Basilica of the Assumption, which is the oldest cathedral in the United States, the cornerstone of which was laid in 1808. The nation's first bishop, John Carroll, is buried beneath the basilica, as are many of my predecessors. John Carroll was a cousin of Charles Carroll, a signer of the Declaration of Independence. Charles Carroll's story, indeed Maryland's early history, teaches us about the fragility of religious liberty and the importance of exercising vigilance in protecting it. Maryland was founded in the mid-17th century by the Catholic Lord Baltimore, and it was founded to be a society where people of different faiths could live together peacefully. This vision was soon codified in Maryland's 1649 Act Concerning Religion, also called the Toleration Act, which was the first law in our nation's history to protect an individual's right to freedom of conscience. Maryland's experiment in religious toleration, however, ended within a few decades. Around the turn of the 18th century, the colony was placed under royal control, and the Church of England became the established religion. Discriminatory laws, including the loss of political rights, were enacted against those who refused to conform. Catholic chapels were closed, and Catholics were restricted to practicing their faith in their homes. The Catholic community lived under those conditions until the American Revolution. Both Charles Carroll and his father, although wealthy landowners, were barred from active participation in politics because of their Roman Catholic faith. Despite this legal restriction, in the early 1770s, Charles Carroll became a powerful voice for independence from British rule. Eventually, he was elected to represent the colony of Maryland and in various committees, and was selected as a delegate to the Continental Congress in 1776. Then Carroll signed the Declaration of Independence, and he was the only Catholic to do so. Just a few years later, our founding fathers included the protection of the free exercise of religion in the First Amendment of our Constitution. In reflecting on his time in the Constitutional Convention, George Washington stated in 1789 these words. He said, "If I could have entertained the slightest apprehension that the Constitution, framed in the convention where I had the honor to preside, might possibly endanger the religious rights of any ecclesiastical society, certainly I would never have placed my signature to it." Washington went on to state, "If I could now conceive that the general government might ever be so administered as to render the liberty of conscience insecure, I beg you will be persuaded that no one would be more zealous than myself to establish effectual barriers against the horrors of spiritual tyranny and every species of religious persecution." And some 20 years later, in 1809, another of our founding fathers, Thomas Jefferson, emphasized the value of freedom of conscience when he stated this. He said, "No provision in our Constitution ought to be dearer to man than that which protects the rights of conscience against the enterprises of the civil authority." And so we can be confident that our founding fathers understood the foundational value of religious liberty and freedom of conscience. But today, we are reminded that the lesson of Maryland's early history and the story of Charles Carroll, we are reminded that religious liberty is fragile. That value is now under attack, and it will require our active vigilance to protect it, not just for ourselves, but for future generations.
And a few housekeeping notes before we go. We have reached out to both the Romney and the Obama campaign, hoping they'll come sit with us for an interview. We'll keep you posted on what they say in the coming weeks. I know many of you have been emailing and calling. When are they appearing on the show? We'll let you know as soon as we do. And remember, EWTN is your network and survives entirely on your assistance. As Mother Angelica used to say, keep us between your gas and electric bill, sweetheart, especially during the summer. Well, that's all the time we have, but the show continues on Facebook and Twitter. Go to RaymondArroyo.com. The Twitter and Facebook pages are linked on the left-hand side of the site. Go like me on Facebook and follow me on Twitter. It's awkward asking you to do that. A very happy and safe Independence Day to you all. Until next week, we'll be scouting the world over for all that is seen and unseen. On behalf of the staff and crew of EWTN News, I'm Raymond Arroyo. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye now.